The TM podcast features adult language and suggestive themes. Hi, I'm Travis, and this is the TM Podcast. And today, I'm going to talk to you about Lonnie David Franklin Jr. You may know him as the Grim Sleeper or the Southside Slayer. I thought I would do one that was a little more recent and a little bit more controversial. And controversial because he was arrested for the death of 10 people, but it's believed that he was responsible for 25 up to 100 people. I'll talk about what is known about the case, and at the end, I'll talk about the alleged other victims. Now, before I get started, I would like to thank my friend Kyle over at the Dad Bod podcast. In his last episode about the Heaven's Gate cult, he gave me a quick shout out, so I thought I'd do the same for him. At the Dad Bod podcast, they take a lighthearted approach to conspiracy, murder, psychology, science, and just generally interesting stuff. They're one of the funniest podcasts that I listen to, and you should too. You can find them anywhere that you can find me at the Dad Bod podcast. Okay, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born August 30th, 1952 in South Central Los Angeles, California. And from this point, I'm going to refer to him as Franklin because his name is just too long and annoying to say over and over. Not much is known about his childhood, but we can imagine that growing up in South Central Los Angeles wasn't easy, as we know this area was and still is known to have a very high crime rate. It's known that he was arrested when he was 16 years old in 1969 for auto theft, but I couldn't find much else about it. At some point, he joined the United States Army and became a cook. He ended up being stationed in Germany at the rank of E4, which is a specialist, and it was there where he committed his first major documented crime. Franklin, along with two other service members, who I won't call soldiers because they don't deserve that title, obviously, rolled up on a 17-year-old girl named Ingrid W. Due to her age and the nature of this crime, German officials will not release her last name, which is completely understandable. Anyways, Franklin and the group pulled up to her and asked her for directions. Ingrid said that it was at this point someone grabbed her and pulled her into the car. One of the men held a knife to her throat as they drove to a remote area. Then, all three of the men gang raped her, and in fear of her life, she tried to play nice after this was over and even gave one of the men her phone number. When they let her go, she immediately went to police. They were able to track the men down pretty quickly because Franklin called the number that she had given him. This would go to trial where Ingrid took the stand in front of Franklin and recounted the events. Franklin and the other boys argued that it was consensual, but he, along with the others, were convicted pretty quickly. He would go to serve 3 years and 4 months in prison and receive a general discharge from the Army. This part confuses me because, for one, why only 3 years for aggravated rape, and second, why not a dishonorable discharge? Maybe someone can explain that better to me, but when I was in the Army, I knew people who were dishonorably discharged for drugs or getting in fights or stealing, so how is rape a general discharge? After he's out of the military, he becomes a sanitation worker for Los Angeles. He was also known to work on cars and even held a job as a mechanic for the 77th Street Police Station for quite some time. During this time, he was still committing and being convicted of crimes to include 2 charges of possessing stolen property, 1 charge of misdemeanor assault, and 1 misdemeanor battery charge. So this guy wasn't a saint by any means, but no one really suspected him of being a serial killer, which is a pretty common statement in these cases. Of course, no one thought he was a serial killer, because if they did, they would have probably told someone. You don't ever see the post-arrest interview with a family member where they're like, "Ooh, I fucking knew he was a murderer." So, whatever. So I'll start with the murders he's currently convicted of, starting with 29-year-old cocktail waitress Deborah Jackson. Deborah's body was found on August 10th, 1985 in an alley. She had been shot twice in the chest and hidden under an old carpet, and she was the first official victim. A year later, the next victim was 35-year-old Henrietta Wright. She was found August 12, 1986 in an alleyway in the 2500 block of West Vernon Avenue. She had also been shot twice in the chest and wrapped in a blanket. Next was 36-year-old Thomas Steele. He was the only official male victim and was found August 13, 1986 in the middle of the intersection of 71st Street. He had a single gunshot wound behind his right ear. The fourth victim was 23-year-old Barbara Ware. Her body was found in an alley on East 56th Street on January 10, 1987. I'm not going to include the entire addresses anymore because Los Angeles addresses are stupid long. She had one gunshot wound to the chest, and her body was discovered underneath a pile of trash. On the same day, an anonymous caller reported seeing the dumping of a body and described seeing a blue and white van fleeing the scene. The fifth victim was 25-year-old Bernita Sparks. Her body was found on April 16, 1987 in an alley on Southwest Avenue. The cause of death was one gunshot wound to the chest, strangulation, and blunt force trauma. She was found inside of a trash can. The sixth victim was 26-year-old Mary Lowe. On November 1, 1987, her body was found in, you guessed it, an alley on Western Avenue. She had a single gunshot wound to the chest. A neighbor reported that they witnessed Mary get into a rust orange Ford Pinto with a young black male the night before. Number 7 was 22-year-old Latricia Jefferson. On January 30th, 1988, her body was discovered underneath a mattress in an alleyway on West 102nd Street. The word AIDS had been written on a napkin and placed over her face. She had 2 gunshot wounds to her chest. Number 8 was 18-year-old Alicia Monique Alexander. Her body was found on September 11th, 1988 on West 43rd Street in an alley. She was also under a mattress and had 2 gunshot wounds in her chest, but she was also the only victim that was found without clothes on. And that may not mean anything depending on the circumstance, but was definitely out of the norm for him to do that. On November 20th, 1988, Enrisha Margette Washington was attacked by a middle-aged black man driving an orange Ford Pinto. She was shot directly in the chest with the same .25 caliber pistol, sexually assaulted, and left to die. She survived and is the only known eyewitness to the Grim Sleeper, and she was able to provide police with enough information for them to actually make a sketch of him. This was the last known victim before Franklin's alleged dormant period. Police believe that he stopped due to the attention from the sketch that was put out from her eyewitness account. Up until that point, all of the killings were attributed to what everyone was calling the, quote, South Side Slayer. The 14-year period of inactivity between this point and killing starting back up again is where the whole Grim Sleeper came from. This is very rare for serial killers because most of them aren't in control of those urges. And Franklin generally doesn't meet the typical serial killer stereotype anyways. He was known to be friendly and quiet, and he would work on cars in his front yard and chat with people as they walked by, which doesn't really seem like the typical introverted, creepy murderer type. And statistically, over 80% of serial killers are white males between the ages of 20 and 30, whereas Franklin, who was a black male, committed his first murder at 32 years old. He was also married and had 2 children, so he definitely didn't fit the norm. So he comes out of dormancy to claim victim number 9, 14-year-old Princess B. And I say Princess B because she has a very hard to pronounce last name, and I'll post it, but I don't want to mess that up. So he kills 14-year-old Princess B on March 9th, 2002. She was found in an alley on South Van Ness Avenue. She had been strangled to death. Number 10 was 35-year-old Valerie McCorvey. She was found on July 11, 2003 near Dinker Avenue. She had also been strangled to death. On May 31, 2005, Detective Cliff Shepard found a match between DNA evidence left on Valerie, Princess, and Mary Lowe, an earlier victim. Police suspected a man named Roger Hausman at this time, but he's later released after his DNA did not match what had been found. The 11th and final official victim was 25-year-old Janisha Peters. She was found on January 1st, 2007 near Western Avenue. She had been shot in the back and dumped in a garbage bag. The next few years would bring a lot of attention, but no answers to this case. There was a task force that was set up in 2007 that operated out of the LAPD headquarters, and there was a website they even made that presented all the known information for everyone to go and look at and hopefully bring attention to the case. In 2008, they offered a $500,000 reward for any information that led to the arrest. It gained so much attention that the case was even featured on America's Most Wanted on an episode in November 2008 in hopes of amplifying all the attention and getting some kind of answers. In 2008, police had attempted to use familial DNA testing to maybe find some links in the case, but they didn't have any luck. And what I mean by that is they compared DNA to genetic information in their felony database. Because when you get arrested for a felony, you have to provide your DNA and it gets put into a database, which is a good idea. And they use this when they can't find an exact match to DNA. They'll use the familial testing to hopefully find a partial match, which could be a family member of that person. This is actually how the Golden State Killer was caught, but I'll get more onto that when I do my episode about him. So they catch a break when they tried this familial testing again in 2010, and they actually got a partial match because his son, Christopher, was arrested in 2009 for a felony weapons charge. So now they just had to get DNA from Franklin himself. And they went about this in the most generic CSI Las Vegas type way. They had a police officer act as a busboy at a restaurant, and he went to this birthday party, and they actually collected his plate, his cup, his pizza crust, and some napkins, and it provided enough DNA evidence to finally link him to those crimes. So on July 7th, 2010, he was arrested and charged with 10 counts of murder. In the interrogations, he denied everything. I could add that audio to this, but it is just so boring. He just keeps saying, I don't know who that is, I don't know her, over and over and over. And even when the investigator says, quote, there is no denying this, your DNA is literally everywhere, he still says, I don't know. And he's not even saying it in a convincing way, but more like an I don't care way. If you just got arrested for murder and someone's like, man, your DNA's everywhere, and you didn't do it, you would probably be like, no way, you'd be freaking out. But this guy's just like, I don't know. I don't know how that happened. That ain't me. Anyways, when they searched his house after they arrested him, they found over 1,000 photos and several hundred hours of videos of women who had been badly beaten or unconscious, presumably dead, and those pictures included some of the victims that had been confirmed already. They actually released some of these photos to the public in hopes of finding any information about the ones that they couldn't identify. Obviously, they didn't release all the photos, but they released the ones that were appropriate and they thought it could help and hopefully bring light and closure to the families. In February of 2016, 30 years after the first victim, Franklin's trial finally started. It would be on May 6th of 2016 when he was finally found guilty for 10 murders. He is currently awaiting death at San Quentin and is still denying everything. To this day, he still says that he doesn't know how any of this happened and it's not him. And I know you're thinking, didn't you say there were 11 victims? And yes, I did, but the third victim, Thomas Steele, could not be linked by any DNA evidence to Franklin. The police suspected him to be the killer because he was actually a friend of one of the other victims, but they couldn't prove it outright in court, so unfortunately, he is not charged for that murder. And to the LAPD, this case isn't over just because he's on death row. There are hundreds of unidentified females in those photos that were found at his house. There are hundreds of Jane Does that died in South Central LA during this time period. And there are hundreds of females that are still missing from that time that we may never know where they are or what happened. Hopefully, with the advancement of science and technology, we may one day live in a time where there are no more unsolved murder cases. But for now, in this case, all we have is speculation based on old evidence. I personally think that there was no dormant period for Franklin. I think that after Anitra Washington survived, he just changed his MO for getting rid of bodies. He was a sanitation worker, and I assume that he knew all the nooks and crannies and ins and outs of the city, and he already viewed these people as trash. So maybe he dumped them somewhere else for a while just to avoid being caught since they were so focused on this. There were actually 2 or 3 other serial killers acting in LA during this time, so it's very possible that he just mimicked their MO. He was also murdering people that were alleged drug addicts, sex workers, and people that go missing regularly without much attention. There was actually a slang term coined during this time by certain police officers. In crimes where homeless or sex workers were involved, they were referred to as NHI cases, which means no human involved, which is terrible, and it doesn't reflect the opinions or views of all police officers or all police officers even in this area during the time, but it just reiterates a point that's proven 1,000 times over in any serial killer case that involves sex workers. And even when he came back, he killed differently, strangling someone and shooting them in the back. I also don't think that he just had 1,000 pictures of other people and all these videos for no reason. I think it's just like the people that were victims in the photos. I think they're all trophies of murders that he committed. And I think the reason that we haven't seen all of the pictures or don't know how many individual different females were in the photos is because the LAPD is probably still investigating this very heavily in hopes of adding names to Franklin's conviction list and bringing closure to families that are involved. I tried to find some alternate theories in this case, but the only thing I found is what his defense attorney actually presented. The defense said that it wasn't Franklin at all, but an unnamed relative. Unfortunately for Franklin, there was no evidence to back this up, and it obviously didn't convince anyone that Franklin wasn't the killer because it was his specific DNA that was found. What do you think? Do you think that 10 is his real number of victims? Do you think it's even him at all? Let me know by sending me a message on any of my social accounts or commenting on the post that I share about this. I'll post a few pictures of Franklin for you to see what he looks like compared to the sketches, and I've really enjoyed the people that have reached out and either told me stories about situations that they had been in or heard of, or let me know something about one of the cases that I didn't know about. For example, a person named Lee Goins on Instagram sent me a message letting me know that he had relatives in Lawsonville. If you haven't listened to it, my last episode was on the Lawson family murders from that general area. He said that after the house was torn down, someone used the wood to build a small covered bridge on their property that you can still see from the road. He said that some of the Lawson family relatives even still live there, and they are still arguing over what really happened that night. And I wonder if they've listened to my podcast about it. Thanks, Lee, and I encourage anyone with any information about the Grim Sleeper, the Green River Killer, the Lawson family, or any other episodes to send me a message, and maybe I'll include what you tell me in an episode just like this. And now I'm going to do the Patreon shoutouts. The first one is Carrie. Carrie is a longtime friend of mine and one of the nicest people I know. Him and his wife are probably the cutest couple that I've ever seen. He's a great musician, and he's also in the Army, and he just recently returned from a deployment. I really appreciate your service, and I appreciate you. Thank you for becoming a patron, Carrie, and I will always love you. The next one is John. John is also a musician, and he's in the band Our Last Trial. They're about to release a new single, which I'm told is supposed to be the heaviest shit that they've ever done. So I'm really excited to hear it, man. Thanks for becoming a patron. Thanks, John. And that's it for this week. I apologize for the delay in getting this episode up. I've been moving for the last few weeks, and my internet provider did not move as fast as I did. But after this episode, everything should be fine and up and on time. And if you like this episode, let me know. Go follow me on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm up everywhere. Keep leaving me 5-star reviews too. And if you would like to support the podcast and become a patron, head on over to patreon.com/thetmpodcast and become a member. The TM Podcast is researched, written, and recorded by myself, and the intro and outro tracks were written by the artist Stress.